Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, June 29th. We're continuing our series of conversations with candidates who are running for statewide office across Vermont, and today it's our pleasure to welcome to our virtual studio Ericka Redic, who is running for the U.S. Congress in the Republican Party primary. That, of course, will be decided on August 9th. And
Yes.
Ms. Redic, thank you very much for making the time for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, welcome to the News Project. Good to have you with us. I guess I just thought we could perhaps start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what prompted you to run for Congress this year.
Great question that I think we want to hear from all of our candidates. My name is Ericka Redic, as you said, born and raised here in Vermont. I grew up in Milton. I went to high school in St. Albans and graduated from Champlain College with a bachelor in accounting. So I've spent much of the last 21 years helping to serve my neighbors, their businesses, making sure that they're making good financial decisions, taking care of themselves, taking care of their families, many of whom I've helped recover from the brink of bankruptcy. Businesses, individuals who found themselves in a circumstance where they really needed some help. My goal really is to do the same thing for Washington, for Congress, our federal government, that I've been doing for businesses and individuals, like I said, for about 21 years now. So with inflation like it is, many of us predicted that this was happening when the federal government started printing money and borrowing and lending at an astronomical rate. We have over $30 trillion in debt, and that doesn't include our unfunded mandates of Social Security and Medicare. And so we just see the federal government really spending more. It's spending future generations' earnings. So what the federal government does with its taxes is it takes your earnings, your labor, and believes that it's entitled to that labor. So it takes a percentage of it for itself and then spends it on things that I don't believe we should be funding. Senator Rand Paul does this amazing project every year. It's called the Festivus, and he outlines some of the most egregious things that our federal government spends money on. And last year, millions of dollars went for a study to test the effect of cocaine on the promiscuity of carrier pigeons. So I don't know about you, Andrew, but I don't really feel like my money, my earnings, my labor should be going to fund things like that. So I'm going to Washington to help bring back an accountable and transparent federal government where the spending makes sense, is reasonable, and is not spending future generations' earnings.
Okay. I guess you sort of touched upon, I guess, what are some of the main issues you're going to be concerned about that'll be at the center of your campaign. And I see in your campaign website that you list families and, by extension, concerns about education delivery and taxes and cost of living, as well as public safety. So I thought maybe we could start by unpacking each one of those a little bit. When you talk about concerns about education delivery, what does that mean exactly?
Well, Vermont spends the second most per pupil of any state in the country. We're only behind New York. And yet we do not have the educational outcomes you would expect for the amount of money that we're putting in. So when I live in Burlington, so a lot of my knowledge or good statistics are from Burlington High School and the Burlington School District. But I know that it's the same across the state because I know teachers and administrators who are struggling with this. So Burlington only graduates about 75% of its high school students, and that 75% that graduate, so 25% do not graduate. And those that do are not at grade level proficiency in their various academic fields, right? So they're not reading at a high school level. They're not doing science at a high school level. I know teachers and administrators around the state who are high school teachers, as an example, who are having to teach middle school curriculum because their seniors in high school can only read at a middle school level. So we're really seeing the failure of our public school system here in Vermont to actually educate our children. We're not doing science and art and music and things like that like we used to. So all the things that used to cultivate critical thinking skills and creativity, the things that actually prepare the next generation of scientists and inventors and things like that. And so if we're spending $20,000 per pupil, everybody should be in AP classes. They should all be prepped for college or ready to start their own business or go to work, go get a certificate to be an electrician or a plumber or things like that. So we really need to be prepping the next generation for the job market and the economy of the future. And we're not doing that.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering, what would you propose as sort of a solution or solutions to that? I'm taking it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that investing more money into the system is probably not what you want to see happen. But if we're not going to do that, and if the opposite course is what you'd like to see, simply from a tax purpose or a tax standpoint, how do we go about, let's say, upping the graduation rate from 75% to something closer to 100?
So I want to be thoughtful to answer your question as a federal candidate and not a statewide candidate. Okay. So what I would say if I were a statewide candidate would be different than as a federal candidate. So I just want to make sure I'm making that distinction, because my ability to make change directly in the state of Vermont as your congresswoman, while I can have the bully pulpit and make suggestions, I'm going to have more of an effect at the federal level as a member of Congress. So what I would be looking to do is really, number one, make sure that the Federal Department of Education has a limited role in making decisions for the states. I think every teacher and educator will tell you that the No Child Left Behind Act has left every child behind. It is very bad. A lot of these standardized tests that are being forced on schools by the Federal Department of Education are not working. They're forcing teachers and schools to teach to a specific curriculum, regardless of the state, the circumstances in the state, the job force in the state. We're a very heavily agricultural state. We don't need the same exact education, for example, as Rhode Island, right? Rhode Island, which is tiny and has a different kind of workforce, different kind of industry, might need a different kind of education. So whenever we see the federal government deciding for everyone and deciding for the states, you see a problem. So I would limit the power of the Department of Education, number one. And number two, I would make sure I would do my best to make sure that the funds that the state collects on behalf of each student actually follows the student. So whether they want to be in a charter school, a public school, homeschool, whatever it is, I believe parents are the best people to decide for their kids and their families how to educate their children. And so, especially now, as it is in Vermont, as an example, now that they're taking school resource officers out of the schools and making children more vulnerable to the predations of evil, I just don't think that if I were a parent, I would want to make sure that I could keep my child safe. And if the state of Vermont, the federal government, decides that they are not deserving of protection in the form of things like school resource officers, I'd want to take them out of school, homeschool them, and make sure I could keep them safe. So I want to see choice, and I want to see that restored to the families and the parents where those decisions are best made.
Okay, before we leave the education question, I just wanted to ask you what you thought of the recent Supreme Court decision that came down, I believe it was last week, involving the situation in Maine, where the Supreme Court held that public dollars could go to schools that had a religious affiliation.
Mhm.
Do you think that that was the right decision on that, or is that kind of muddying the waters between church and state separation?
The church and state separation is misconstrued a lot in this country, and I think that shows actually a deficiency in our civics education. So since we're talking about education, um, there's nothing in the Constitution, first of all, that says we need to keep church and state separate. What it says is the state will not establish a church, which is what you had in England and things like that. That was one of the reasons we fought a Revolutionary War. Was we said we do not want the state to decide what the religion should be, because if you think about it, every 4 years that could change. And what the founders were doing was really trying to establish stability, and something that people could rely on and make decisions and invest and do all of that. And so it is not saying that you can't have, so there's that. But I don't understand personally why we would discriminate against schools that have religious affiliation. If we're going to say that people can homeschool, if it's a Christian family homeschooling, what's the difference between that and them going to a school with, a Catholic school or something like that? I don't really see the difference personally. I don't think that we should be discriminating. I think that those dollars should follow the student, period, regardless of where the parent decides to send them. It was the right decision.
Wanted to ask you what your thoughts were around a big issue. It's been a large issue here in Vermont for a couple of years now, nothing really new, but that's around the whole question of housing, or the lack of available, affordable workforce housing. If you're elected, and I realize that this goes beyond the power of any one congressperson to really fix or anything, but
Yeah.
what would be some of your thoughts on how the state, since this is really a national issue as well, it's not just confined obviously to Vermont, we should be doing about housing?
I'm not sure that it is an issue around the country. I have friends and family that live in states like Mississippi, Arkansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, all over the place, and they're not having a hard time finding housing. Where they're having a hard time finding housing is in large cities where you have incredibly restrictive zoning issues. You have rent control and things like that, which drive up the costs. So a lot of major cities that are democratically run are really unaffordable, whether it's Burlington or Austin, Texas, or San Francisco, California. They're all Democrat-led cities. And we see, even though their politicians say that they care about housing and affordable housing, we see it just continue to get more and more expensive. So City Council of Burlington, as an example, says they care about the working class, and so they want to help them, and they raise taxes, and then they raise property taxes. And they don't realize that that means it makes it more unaffordable to live here, because you just increased the cost to live in Burlington. So we see really destructive and irresponsible policies being put forth by Democrat leadership in places like Burlington, Austin, around the country. So there's that. And as an extension of that, in Vermont, we have Act 250. So if I want to build an apartment building in the state of Vermont, and we're not even going to consider the local zoning issues in any various city. We're just going to talk about Act 250. If I want to build an apartment building, a 13-unit apartment building, it's going to cost me about $100,000 in permits and fees before I've put a shovel in the ground or done an architectural drawing. So when we see the severe restriction and limitation by our own laws, we don't get to be surprised that investors, people with capital, don't want to come here to build. They just don't. It costs more to build here. If I can build here in Vermont or Texas, where there's no Act 250 and there's none of, and I don't have to fight legal battle after legal battle after legal battle, which happens here, right? We saw that with City Place downtown. They basically sued them out of existence. Now we still have a hole in the ground 5 years later instead of 100 housing units. Anyway, I digress. We have restricted our own ability to build, and it is Vermont's fault. It is Democrat leadership that continues to restrict people's ability to build here. The continued growth and expansion of the state government and the federal government makes it more and more expensive to live here, so people don't want to live here. I talk to people every day who are leaving the state because they can't afford to live here anymore. They want to raise a family. And all of that is a direct result of things like Act 250 restricting our ability to build, people like my opponent, Becca Ballant, encouraging more and more costs that make Vermonters responsible for what she believes we should be responsible for. So the state government, federal government is just taking more of your labor. It believes it's entitled to more and more of your labor, making it impossible to live here for a normal, average, working class family. And so that is really what we need to do. We need to get government out of the way. We need responsible, accountable government that only pays for the services we actually need, not earmarks for special interest groups and pet projects of our elected officials.
Okay. Boy, there's a long conversation we could have on that subject if we had more. But
That is true.
I'm gonna try and move.
That's a whole interview by itself.
Here, I'm going to cover a few other areas. I mean, sort of turning more to current events type stuff. I mean, one of the areas I've been hearing a lot about is that that more resources ought to be deployed for mental health services for youngsters and for people at all ages, probably.
Yes.
Would you agree with that? And if so, should taxes be increased to pay for those mental health services?
Oh, some of my Republicans might not like this answer. If I'm going to pay taxes, I at least want it to go to something like mental health. Things that we actually really need and will make an impact on our society and people at large. Whether or not all of that is the government's role rather than the community's role to come around people and help. I feel this is a whole other conversation because we got to talk about the breakdown of the family, fatherless homes. 75%, a person is, I'm trying to remember the statistics. So, you are more likely to end up a drug addict in jail and all of these other things if there's not a father in the home. Okay. So what we saw as an example with the tragedy in Uvalde is the actual human cost of broken families, drug addiction, and trauma. So my husband and I volunteer with an organization called the Catalyst Collective, and they have this program called the Purpose Project. And what they've done is collaborate with Williamson County in Central Texas. So Williamson County Juvenile Court is actually sentencing their offenders to do the Purpose Project. And what they do is they work with a mentor who helps them discover their natural gifts and talents and how they might be able to use that towards what they're passionate about. And what they've seen is that 95% of the kids that go through that program do not reoffend, and they go on to live happy, productive lives, and they get out of the justice system. Because now what they've had is someone pour into their lives, demonstrate that they care, and a willingness to love them and care for them and help direct their lives. And so it is having a tremendous impact. And so what we really need to see, why the Boys and Girls Club in Burlington isn't filled with people mentoring kids is beyond me. I think anybody who wants to see a better world needs to understand that they're actually responsible for that. No government bureaucrat can love the next generation enough to help pull us out of this morass that we're in, okay? We need human beings to help other human beings. And that requires us getting involved. It requires sacrificing a few hours a week or a few hours a month to help our neighbors. And so I want to be really careful to not continue down this road that we're on that says the government is the solution to all of our problems, because it's just not. And when we look back on history, some of the worst atrocities and the most shameful times in American history were because the government decided it knew better how people should live their lives. So, whether it's slavery, Jim Crow, the Tuskegee experiments, we as Americans have to be really careful trusting the government with the mental health and safety of our neighbors. I believe we're responsible for that.
And you touch, obviously there's a connection here between that and the whole concern we've been hearing, and you mentioned it, the event in Uvalde, Texas, around gun safety. I mean, should there be legislation that came before Congress next year, and if you were elected, what would be your stance on gun safety? Should the recent bill that was passed bipartisanly in Congress, is that a template in your mind as to a pretty good way to end that, or at least arrive at least for the time being? Or should there have been more or less done in that congressional action?
Well, that congressional action is wholly unconstitutional. So what people need to understand is that red flag laws do away with the right to due process. So in our Constitution, we are guaranteed what's called due process, which means that if you're accused of a crime, you get to go before a judge and they have to prove that you actually did it. And with red flag laws, what we see is they're actually removing that right from American citizens. So I am wholly against red flag laws. I'm wholly against those things. Now, if gun laws worked, we wouldn't have had many of the circumstances that we have, because people would follow the law. But the nature of these kinds of heinous crimes is that these people they're not law abiders, right? They're going to figure out a way to cause harm no matter what. And the idea that it's okay to take due process rights away from American citizens because of the behavior of a few, I think is very unconscionable. And I think Americans should be very afraid of anyone who would suggest that they can take away your constitutional rights, especially something like due process. Because if that's the case, then they can just throw you in jail and not have to tell you why, not try you speedily, and all of these other things. So I'm very concerned by any of those kinds of things that are passed. Now, this is also why I talk about the Purpose Project and Catalyst Collective. So we need to actually be getting people the help that they need so that they aren't resorting to violence. The young man in Uvalde, his parents were addicts, in jail. He was basically abandoned. He was a statistic. And so we don't get to be surprised by that. The community knew that he was unwell. There's video of him holding a bag of dead cats that he had killed. So there was a real failure of the system in his case. He had been picked up by the police before, all of these things. So, I might be okay with a law like changing it so that you can't seal juvenile records of violent individuals. So if this young man had committed the crimes that he did before he was 18, after 18, he would have not been eligible for those guns that he was able to purchase. So I'm for maybe doing some adjustments there for violent history. But we want to be really, really careful taking away people's rights.
In the time we have left, there's a whole cluster of questions I could think to ask around the public safety question. And
well, we can do this again in a month or so. How about that?
Well, maybe. Yes, we might have another opportunity. That's absolutely correct. I was just thinking though, before since you have an accounting background and taxes and economics, I'm sure very important to you, as they are to everybody, I guess.
Yeah,
I
especially
just wanted
now.
to ask you what your thoughts were on sort of rebalancing the economic competitiveness of rural areas with more urban ones. I mean, we've seen a lot of discussion, at least I've read a fair amount recently, about what it's going to be, what it's going to take to kind of make rural areas, and we could look at rural areas in Vermont, in Northeast Kingdom, and other places, Southwest Vermont, down here as well. Um, and one of the areas that's been pointed to frequently is to increase and improve high-speed broadband service.
Mm.
I guess I just wondered, what do you think we might do or could be done, or the private sector could do that it's not already doing, to sort of rebalance the equation a little bit between rural and urban parts of Vermont and parts of the country as a whole?
Well, my understanding, and I could be wrong, and I might, Andrew, I might be answering this question and have to put my foot in my mouth later. But my understanding is Elon Musk or Tesla or whatever actually has satellites that they put up around the country and around the world that provide high-speed internet access. So we don't have to have we don't have to build out the infrastructure of all the cables and wires and things like that. In theory, if Vermont did a good job with its budget, which it does not, that's a whole other conversation. We could afford one of those satellites and we could offer broadband. We could offer high-speed internet to those rural areas. And that's kind of what I think we should be looking for, is these new innovative ways to bring this kind of technology to rural areas. And the thing to also keep in mind, I could be wrong about this, I think a lot of people live in rural areas because they don't want to live in cities. They don't want to be in places where they're surrounded by a lot of people. And so we really want to try to preserve our open spaces. And we really want to try to preserve rural living rather than trying to make them all be like city people, right? So I think it's important that we bring that, if we can provide internet access through something like a Tesla satellite, I think we should do that. We just also want to make sure that people want it, that they want all of these services, that they want this kind of stuff, and that it would be a good use of government resources.
Okay, well, golly, time flies when you're having fun. We're going to have to leave it there for today, but as you suggested, perhaps we'll have another opportunity to pick up where we left off and,
Excellent.
look at a few more areas a little more deeply. There's several that come readily to mind. But anyway, for now, I guess we'll have to leave it there. But wanted to thank you again, Ms. Redic, for your time today. And to all of you folks who have been watching, I hope you found the program interesting. And we still have several more candidates left to go. There were a lot of you out there this year.
Yes.
It's been hard to keep up with everyone. But anyway,
Yes. Having an open seat definitely changes things.
yes, it sure does. That retirement by Senator Leahy definitely opened the doors to a
Yeah.
floodgate of aspirants. Anyway, well, thank you again,
Yes.
Ms. Redic. I appreciate your
Thank you,
time,
Andrew.
and have a great day. And perhaps we'll have a chance to resume the conversation in a couple of months or so.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Thank you.